Hey, Rachel. I'm glad you could join us at Stanford Blockchain. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
do you want to tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do at Offchain Labs?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Rachel. I'm a tech lead at Offchain Labs, and I work specifically on Stylus, this new upgrade to the Arbitrum chains that I'm sure we're going to jump into quite a bit today. So yeah, I've been working at Offchain Labs for about 3 years, and we're the primary service provider to the Arbitrum Foundation. So we do a lot of the engineering and development of the tools that power the Arbitrum network, like the node software, the sequencer, and all sorts of really cool stuff.
Perfect. Yeah, so I've heard a lot about Arbitrum Stylus. It was super cool. Ed Felton gave us a really great talk at BAS at Stanford just a couple weeks back. So super excited to learn more. So just to get things started, do you want to tell me what is kind of like the motivation behind Stylus and like at a high level, what kind of this new addition is? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So Stylus allows you to deploy smart contracts written in programming languages like Rust, C, and C++ alongside existing Solidity ones on Arbitrum chains. So right now, if somebody wants to design an application for the blockchain, they have to, on an Arbitrum network, use a Web3 specific programming language like Solidity or Viper, or there's some other ones, but basically those are the primary ones people use. But if you're someone who doesn't know a Web3 language, you have to go learn Rust or C or C++, or I'm sorry, you have to go learn these languages and can't use the ones that you already know. Um, I think some good numbers that might help make the picture clear. There's something like 20 to 25,000 Solidity developers out there, whereas there's tens of millions of developers who use other languages. Like I think there's 12 million devs who know C or C++ and 3 million who know Rust. So we're talking about orders of magnitude different in terms of the developer bases. And a consequence of this is that if you want to enter Web3, it's very hard. Like if you're a traditional company and you're thinking about like, hey, we have this video game, it's awesome, it's written in C++, like how do I get onto the blockchain? Well, right now the value proposition is really bad, right? It's like, oh, well, I would have to hire or train someone in Solidity, but evaluating developers for a language you don't already use internally is very challenging, right? Like, how do you enter a space and know who to talk to and know what to do? In order to really, begin a Web3 presence or whatever. But with Stylus, all of this changes, right? You're able to take your game, perhaps written in C++, and just taking the same tooling and stuff that you already know and love, continue your work, but using our nice libraries and frameworks and stuff. So that's like really what that's essentially what Stylus is. It's on testnet today, so if anybody wants to try this out, like you can. And yeah, that's what Stylus does from a like developer experience perspective. But there's also another part to it, which is that it cuts fees. So in Stylus, computation is 10 to 100 times cheaper. And then there's other things like the amount of RAM you use is 100 to 500 times cheaper, among other gas savings. And so if you're thinking about like, how do we scale Web3, Stylus does it in two ways. It, of course, just makes transactions and stuff cheaper, which of course means then that you can have more price sensitive applications on the blockchain, but it also scales the number of developers, right? It's amazing what's been built with about 25 or something thousand developers, but it would be amazing if we could tap more into the large existing Web2 space that there is. So yeah, hopefully that helped makes some sense of it.
That's a great introduction to Stylus. Thank you so much for that. I'm curious as to whether you see kind of like Stylus and the WASM picture kind of being like a replacement for the EVM, or do you see as them more being complementary? So like in the future, do you see someone using a combination of both Solidity and say Rust to develop something, or mostly just Rust?
That's a great question. I believe that having both is paramount. So the stylus model doesn't replace the Ethereum virtual machine. So on a stylus or in a chain with Arbitrum Stylus enabled, there's both the EVM and the stylus VM. And these two virtual machines work together to produce the results that the chain needs. And What's really cool about that is it's a huge shift in perspective, right? Like before, everyone was asking, like, how do we have one virtual machine that does everything? But in the Stylus model, you can have two. And this means then that all the existing stuff that exists in the Solidity world, right? All those amazing dApps that power the huge ecosystem on Arbitrum, they continue to work exactly as they did before exactly as they did before without Stylus, post the Stylus upgrade. So you get access to all the liquidity, all of the ecosystem, all of the tooling and know-how and support that already exists in the EVM. But then you now have additionally this other option available to you, which is to develop in Rust or C or C++, or the other languages that we intend to add. And what's really cool about that is you kind of just pick whatever is best for your application. Right now, there's like, if you wanted to go work in Rust, say, you would have to go to a chain that only does Rust or really only does Rust well. They might technically have support for other things, but it's not like first class support. But in the Stylus model, it's not an either or, it's a both and. You get all the benefits that the EVM gives you and all of the benefits that the Stylus VM gives you. And so something though that I think is really important to realize how this all coheres is that contracts written with the Stylus SDK are Solidity equivalent. That is, if you write a ERC20 in Rust, all of its methods use the Solidity ABI. And that means that an existing DEX written in Solidity without modifications can list Rust tokens, and vice versa, right? You could have, an NFT written in Rust that calls out to a Solidity API that then does some seek work. Maybe the C does some cryptography or what have you. And in this manner, like all of these contracts are fully composable and work in a coherent manner that like we really haven't seen before. So I challenge the idea that like you have to find the best tech that then replaces everything else. It can actually be a composition of great technologies. We can have all the goodness of the EVM and all of the goodness of the Stylus VM in one.
That sounds super awesome. Super excited for this. I mean, you mentioned how there's like an element of like interoperability between the EVM and the Stylus VM. So I'm curious on how, maybe if we dive a little bit into the implementation details, how does Stylus like ensure compatibility between these two separate engines, shall we say?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way it works is that you have two virtual machines that are backed by the same state trie. So what that means then is that like, yes, while the Stylus VM computes results in a different manner, it still commits them and accesses the same affordances the same way. So like if you want to go write permanent storage, you use the same trie structure that you do in the EVM. Like if you think there's a way of looking at chains where like changes are done, or okay, there's a way of looking at chains where you think of this notion of the state transition function. That is, a blockchain essentially takes an input, transitions to a new state by computing, deltas with that input, and then writes that result at the end. The Stylus VM just gives you a new way to compute a result, but it doesn't fundamentally change how the other components of the system works. So like at a lower level, when you call a contract, you load its bytecode from the database. Well, the bytecode normally would just be EVM bytecode and you'd go execute that. But if it starts with a special header, if your contract's code starts with a Ethereum object format inspired header, it'll go, oh wait, this isn't an EVM contract, this is a WASM contract. So WebAssembly is the tech that powers the Stylus virtual machine. And all you got to do once you see that header is instead of using the Ethereum virtual machine to compute the call, you go use the Stylus virtual machine. And so what happens then is we read that the contract is a Stylus one, and then we go execute that call using Stylus. Now, if in that call, another call is made to an Ethereum contract, say, or I'm sorry, an EVM contract, say, then you just switch back to the EVM. And in this manner, execution flow passes between the two of them until finally you compute a final result, and then that gets computed to the blockchain. In terms of security, what's really cool is this. Arbitrum Nitro, that's the big upgrade that happened to the Arbitrum chain last year. It uses WebAssembly to do its fraud proofs. And Stylus really just does the same thing. We have the ability to do fraud proofs in WASM. Why not also run and execute WASM? And that's essentially like the big breakthrough that Stylus has is we've got this big WASM fraud proving mechanism. What if we brought that to userland where applications themselves could use WASM? And then I guess to just briefly touch on like what WASM is in case anyone hasn't heard of WebAssembly before, web browsers need to be fast and JavaScript is often pretty slow. So there's this industry standard that's kind of come about where people are able to, instead of having their application code run in JavaScript or TypeScript or one of these other like JS runtime languages, instead you can use what's called WebAssembly, where a language like Rust or C, or really honestly any of the languages that you've heard of probably have some kind of WASM support, and that allows it to run in the web browser. And so what's actually really cool about this is we get to take advantage of all of the breakthroughs that have happened in Web 2, right? So like, Chrome and Firefox and all these server-side applications that Apple, Microsoft, Google, et cetera, are doing, they use WASM and WebAssembly to do the stuff that they need. And we just get to inherit all of the fast runtimes, amazing tooling, and other things and processes that have made WASM so powerful. And yeah, so Nitro was a bet on WASM's future, and Stylus is just a continued, advancement of that. I hope that gives some insight. Any questions on it?
That sounds super interesting. Love the discussion of like the technical details and stuff. I know that like WASM has been generally like within, not just in Arbitrum, but like for other chains as well, there's been a push towards integrating WASM into like the execution layer and stuff like that. So I'm also curious is how does Stylus's VM kind of contrast or like compare with other WASM-based execution environments? And how do you see maybe an element of interoperability going forward with WASM as kind of like basically like an intermediary?
Yeah, absolutely. WASM is the future. I think a really cool quote from Solomon Hykes, he's the guy who created Docker, or one of the co-founders of Docker. So when he actually said that if WASM existed in 2008, they wouldn't have had to make Docker. And that's kind of telling, right? I mean, Docker, what a pervasive application that everyone uses, right? But if WASM just existed a little earlier, he says he wouldn't have had to make it. So that's quite the endorsement of the tech. And so like anyone else who's also building WASM technologies, I think they're in the right direction. This is very important. But to contrast it, the big difference between the Stylus VM and other ones is that composability. The fact that your smart contract looks and behaves like a Solidity one, so that you can tap into the existing liquidity and applications and ecosystem support that exists on Arbitrum chains. So you'll notice on all these other WASM chains, they don't have Solidity. Or if they do, it's like a really awkward Solidity that has all these gotchas and it's not really what you're used to. You don't get that like Premier Layer 1 experience, that EVM equivalent experience on layer 2 or an alt L1 if it isn't EVM based, right? So having both of these VMs together is the big breakthrough. But of course, because this is WASM, that means that a chain that also uses it will also be fast. And if WASM runtimes become twice as fast in the next year, then other chains will also. Something that's really cool too is the Stylus SDK is open source. So conceivably, other chains could add support for some of the stuff that we're doing. And we really believe in having like that kind of like collaboration and stuff. So it's a bit technical on how that would look, but the cool part is there's not like in principle, Stylus code could potentially be ran on different chains, which would be super cool.
That's pretty cool. That is definitely really cool. So I'm guessing like moving on to more of like the use cases and general feedback of like the Stylus VM and stuff like that. So what has been kind of like the general demographic of the users that have tried out Stylus so far? Are they mostly new devs with Rust experience or experienced Solidity devs? How do you think that might also change in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Stylus testnet has been up for a few weeks. It's actually hot off the presses. So it's not like we've had like a few months to really see who's super interested in building like the next app on it. But we've had a lot of great feedback, kind of from across the space. So whenever you launch a blockchain product, the first people who look at it are those already in blockchain. And what's really cool is there's been interest from even some surprising places. Like, for example, Viper is a programming language, right, that people use for the EVM. Well, they're considering writing a Stylus target for it. So right now in Viper, it compiles to EVM bytecode, but it might be the case soon that it compiles to WASM at your option. And since I said that, like, Stylus is 10 to 100 times cheaper when it comes to computation, that's a big deal for something like Viper, because then all of a sudden the same Viper code, the contract without modifications, can now be way cheaper when you want to go use it, you know, on an Arbitrum chain. So that's another way you can get compatibility there. So the reception's been really, really amazing. And there's teams from the from like all L1 communities that are doing a lot of Rust stuff that are like, oh, amazing, we can tap into Arbitrum's liquidity, and they're working on it too. But how I imagine this changes over time is, you know, once we actually have this on mainnet and people are able to launch and deploy and do all that cool stuff on existing Arbitrum chains. Of course, pending a DAO vote, this is decentralized. So the community needs to vote for Stylus's adoption. But assuming that happens, because I don't really see why anyone would really be against this. This is a really positive thing, right? But it is decentralized, so it's up to the delegates. But pending Arbitrum's upgrade, I think what we'll see is a bunch of the existing Web2 people make the jump. I saw there was a great article from Forbes the other day about how a lot of these credit card companies are really struggling to find Solidity developers. Like, they want to get into Web3, but like we talked about earlier, training new engineers or even knowing how to assess like the partnership potential of different teams, it's just hard, right? If you're not a Web3 expert and you don't know our terminology and our teams and our history and our languages and our tooling, it's just a big ask to be like, jump into Web3. And so something that I imagine is going to happen is that like all those millions, or I suppose tens of millions of developers out there working in other languages will suddenly find that the barrier to entry has been lowered, and jumping into Web3, you can still use the same tools you know and love. I'll give a cool example that's coming out actually within the next couple of weeks. You're about to be able to use GDB, the GNU debugger, on Stylus. That's right. On an Arbitrum chain, you will be able to step through your program and use like debugging symbols and all of that stuff. Now, the GNU debugger is just one thing, but my point here is general, right? The fact that you can use all of this existing tooling that's had decades of support and focus and efficiencies, you know, all of this stuff, right? You now get to use that stuff on blockchains and not have to learn new things, and you can evaluate engineers. So when I'm thinking about like how the demographics are going to change over time, I think we're going to see more and more Web2 people jump in. But given that it's only been up on a test net for a few weeks, you know, I wouldn't expect that, you know, in the immediate future, but shouldn't be too much longer.
Definitely. Super looking forward to it. So you mentioned that like it's 10 to 100 times cheaper for computation. So what kind of like guarantees that? And like with that in mind, is it like particularly useful for like specific verticals that would benefit from using WASM? So for example, maybe gaming or DeFi, and what are some of like these vertical use cases that you would think of making use of this feature?
Absolutely. Let me start by explaining why it's faster, and then I'll explain like how people can then take advantage of it. So the first part, why is this faster? Well, I think it's illustrative to look at the example of the add instruction. So in the EVM, there is an instruction that performs an add. Here's how it works. The first thing is it charges for gas. So the Ethereum virtual machine sees that an add costs 3 gas. And how does it do that? It looks at an in-memory table, fetches the add instruction, says, oh, that's 3 gas, and then charges 3 gas. Okay, so that's the first step. The second step is it will then consider if it needs to do tracing. Even if tracing is not enabled, it still has to consider if it needs to do that. And so then it makes that decision. There's a branch involved there. The next thing it does is it pops 2 items off the simulated stack. So recall that Ethereum virtual machine interprets EVM bytecode. So there's a simulated stack that has all this memory, and you pop 2 items off of it. Well, then the next step is you add those together. And then the next step is you push that onto the simulated stack, once again, touching all of this memory. And then you adjust the program counter to the next instruction. Those are the steps necessary to do an add in the EVM, and it costs 3 gas. In the Stylus model, you just do an add. You just do an x86 or an ARM add. That's right. You use the assembly that your specific computer uses to do that add. And for that reason, an add in the EVM is 150 times more expensive than an add in the WASM VM, or in the Stylus VM, I should say. You might be wondering, like, how does gas work? Well, something that's really cool is that in Stylus, instead of paying for gas every single opcode, so like in the EVM, you do an add, you pay for gas. You do a division, you pay for gas. You know what I'm saying? It's like every instruction you're doing a gas charge. Well, in the Stylus model, you buy gas for entire groups of instructions at a time. So you might buy a block's worth of, or I shouldn't say a block, but you might buy like several instructions in a row at once. And we have like documentation on how exactly that works. But the point is, it's instead of every single instruction having to interrupt and do that, you just buy it once and then run a bunch of instructions, then buy again and run a bunch of instructions. And so you'll find that the fact that that's how the VM works just drastically cuts the costs. But it gets even better. So one other thing is this: not only are the actual opcodes faster, the opcodes you run are better. And what I mean by that is this: the Rust and C and C++ and other compilers that compile to WASM use industry standard tooling. So if you're using GCC or Clang or something, you're just going to produce a better bytecode than the Solidity compiler will. You're getting to take advantage of decades of work in LLVM or optimizations or whatever, right? And so because of that, not only is it that the virtual machine itself is faster, the compiler used to make the code that runs in the VM is faster. So that is why Stylus cuts costs so dramatically. There's more nuanced stuff you can see in our documentation, but in the interest of time, we'll leave we'll leave the summary to that. Now, what does that enable? Well, computation being cheaper kind of affects everything, right? If you're in DeFi, financial primitives and stuff become cheaper. Like if you think about perpetuals, these are a very exciting kind of product that a lot of teams are offering. Well, they use a lot of computation. Well, now those expensive financial computations can be made much cheaper. And we happen to know that in the financial space, right, cutting fees dramatically increases demand. People are very price sensitive to a lot of these operations. And so having your primitives that back your programs being really cheap just opens up so many new possibilities. And by the way, because Stylus is ABI equivalent to Solidity, you can actually write parts of your program in Rust or C. So it might be the case that if you're running some fancy DEX or some market maker strategy or whatever it is you're doing, right, you could have the core part be written in like a language like C or something and accelerate the computation that way, but then have all the other contracts be written in Solidity. It's all plug and play in this manner. So maybe like the most performance intensive part, you go put in a new Web 2 language, but the rest of your application, you could choose to do it in Solidity. Of course, you could also do the entire thing in Rust or C. So, it's kind of just like at your option, how much of this you want to integrate into your product. Other products that are affected, like gaming, just the fact that you're able to like go take C++ libraries and stuff off the shelf. Like this is a big part. The fact that you can use libraries that already exist in Web 2 that are industry standard that everyone's depending on in your blockchain code is crazy. Like recently we published a generative NFT that used Rust and we needed the ability to create PNGs from it. Well, it was as simple as just importing a PNG library, right? And like, the fact that you can just do that opens everything up. You don't have to reinvent the wheel to build the things that power the future. You can stand on the shoulders of giants, so to speak, and import the library code you care about and build the stuff on top of it. So I think it affects every app, every use case really, because what is a blockchain if not computation plus storage plus the other component parts of that make up a transaction's fees?
That sounds perfect. I love the grand vision and stuff. I know that we're almost wrapping up on time, but I wanted to give you like one last question is just on a bigger level. So how does Stylus fit into the bigger picture for Offchain Labs, Arbitrum, and kind of the overarching ecosystem? It's like what general direction is that going to take it in? And how do you see that playing out?
That's a great question. So a lot of stuff is happening at the same time. Like for example, there's this other thing we're working on at the same time called Bold that's going to make validation permissionless on Arbitrum chains, which is a big deal, right? Like being able to have decentralization. Like when I think about what is Offchain Labs' vision, it's completely decentralizing layer 2, but it's also scaling layer 2, right? Like the promise of layer 2 is decentralized scaling for layer 1s. And if we're wanting to make Ethereum as great as possible, having these really rich runtimes and all of the stuff without the security trade-off is a big deal. So I think Stylus fits in the vision of making things more performant while not having those trade-offs. But I also think it's just this, right? Like, if you want to have blockchain scale to the next billion developers, you got to scale to the next million. I'm sorry. If you want to scale to the next billion users, you need to scale to the next million developers. This is something we often talk about. Like, having that future where crypto is integrated in everything, and there's this fuzzy line between like the traditional financial system and the decentralized one, right? DeFi. If you're going to get there, it has to be the case that you meet developers where they're at. And since they're using languages like Rust or C or C++, and the others that we intend to add support for soon, we should just meet them where they're at and provide tooling and products and stuff like that, so that Web3 can continue to grow in its size and become more and more part of everybody's lives. So that's kind of the vision. It's a big one, but I feel really good about it.
Perfect. Yeah, I feel really good about it as well. There's so much amazing stuff coming out of like Offchain Labs and Arbitrum. It was super great to talk about Stylus today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. Really appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much.